The night stretched over Los Angeles like a velvet curtain, glittering with flashes of camera lights and restless anticipation. The premiere of Eclipse City, Keanu Reeves' newest film, had turned the boulevard into a river of noise, cheers, and shimmering sequins. Fans pressed against the barricades, calling his name as if he were both a hero and a myth. A long black car pulled up to the carpet, and the shouting grew louder. Photographers shifted, camera shutters clicked in sync. But when the door opened, the energy changed. Keanu stepped out quietly, adjusting his black suit jacket with the same calm, almost hesitant grace that defined him. No grand gesture, no showmanship, just presence, quiet and undeniable. He nodded politely at the flashes, offered a soft smile, and waved once. Then he began walking, slow, deliberate, as if each step carried a weight the rest of the world couldn't see. He shook a few hands, paused to sign a poster, even knelt down to greet a young fan holding a "You're my hero" sign. He smiled gently, said thank you, and kept moving. There was something different about him tonight. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't here either, not completely. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, drifted past the noise, past the walls of cameras, searching for something that wasn't there. A reporter tried to get his attention. "Keanu, over here. How does it feel to be back on the big screen?" But he just gave a small nod, the kind that said enough without saying anything at all. When he reached the entrance, an usher guided him toward his reserved seat inside the theater. Keanu stopped for a moment, glancing at the chart in her hand. "Leave one empty," he said quietly. She blinked, unsure. "Sir, one seat. Next to mine. Don't let anyone take it." She hesitated, then nodded and made a note. It was an unusual request, but his tone left no room for questions. As he entered the hall, the crowd erupted into applause. Colleagues waved, castmates smiled, but Keanu only offered polite nods. When he reached his row, he paused again, eyes fixed on that single, unoccupied chair beside him. He didn't touch it, didn't say a word, just stared for a second longer than most people would. And when the lights dimmed and the opening credits rolled, his hand rested gently on the armrest of that empty seat, like muscle memory. Like holding someone's hand who wasn't there anymore. To everyone else, it was just a premiere. But for him, it was something else entirely, a quiet reunion with a ghost only he could feel. Inside the theater, the chaos melted into murmurs and soft orchestral music. The air smelled of perfume, velvet seats, and freshly buttered popcorn, luxury wrapped in nostalgia. People were laughing, clinking glasses, taking selfies before the show. But Keanu moved differently. He wasn't soaking in the glamour. He was walking through it like a man passing through fog, looking for something beyond it. He reached his row, front and center, and sat down quietly. Around him, the seats filled fast. Co-stars, producers, journalists, faces he'd seen for decades. But the one beside him stayed empty, exactly as he'd asked. The usher had tied a small, reserved tag to it, not knowing it was reserved for someone who would never arrive. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling the show was about to start, but Keanu's eyes stayed fixed on that empty chair. His fingertips brushed the edge of its armrest, barely a movement, but full of weight. The chatter around him faded into background noise as he sank deeper into his thoughts. He remembered her, the way she laughed with her whole face, the way she'd call him Kiki when no one else dared. She was his biggest supporter long before the world knew his name. When he couldn't afford acting classes, she sold her guitar to help him. When his first film flopped, she told him, "You're not supposed to play heroes. You're supposed to be one." And now, years later, he still carried her voice in the quietest corners of his mind. As the first trailer started to play, he looked at the seat again. A faint smile tugged at his lips. He whispered under his breath, so low no one could hear, "This one's for you." On the big screen, the opening scene of Eclipse City flickered to life, but Keanu barely noticed. For a moment, the theater disappeared, the lights, the applause, the noise. All he saw was his sister, sitting right there beside him, grinning that same mischievous grin, whispering, "See? I told you you'd make it." He didn't wipe his eyes. He didn't shift in his seat. He just let the emotion sit with him, quiet, steady, and real. Because some people never leave. They just change where they sit. The movie played on, its sound filling the dark theater, but for Keanu, the noise blurred into something distant, like waves against glass. The laughter, the dialogue, the audience's reactions, all of it faded beneath the quiet pulse of his own heartbeat. He sat perfectly still, his posture calm, yet inside his mind, time was slipping backward. Every scene that flashed across the screen, every moment of triumph and pain, pulled him deeper into his memories. He thought about the two of them when they were kids. Their apartment had been small, cold in the winter, full of mismatched furniture. But it had been home. He remembered his sister running through the hallway with socks on, sliding on the floor, and laughing until she fell over. She was always louder than life, the kind of girl who could turn an ordinary Tuesday into a celebration. When he moved to Hollywood, she was the one who made him promise not to change. "If you ever become famous," she'd said, "just don't forget to be kind." He hadn't forgotten. Not once. When she got sick, he visited her every day he wasn't filming. He brought her books, flowers, old records they used to dance to. He would sit by her hospital bed, reading scripts aloud just to make her smile. And even when she was too weak to speak, she'd still manage to whisper, "I'm proud of you, Kiki." That memory hit him now like a wave he couldn't dodge. He could still feel her small, trembling hand squeezing his as if to say, "Keep going." He blinked, looking at the glowing screen but not seeing it. The lead character on screen was giving a speech about loss, about love that doesn't fade with time. The audience was still. Keanu's jaw tightened. It felt too real, too close. He turned his head slightly toward the empty seat, the dim glow from the screen reflecting off the smooth leather. For a heartbeat, it almost looked occupied, like a shadow of her was sitting there, smiling softly in the flickering light. And then he exhaled. Slow, silent. People came to the movies to escape reality. But for Keanu, this wasn't escape. It was remembrance, a reunion with someone the world had forgotten. But he never could. The scene ended, the credits rolled, and the audience broke into applause. Cameras flashed again as people turned toward Keanu, trying to capture his reaction. But he didn't move. He sat perfectly still, hands clasped loosely in front of him, eyes fixed on the glowing screen that had already faded to black. He could feel everyone around him, the clapping, the laughter, the energy, but none of it reached him. His world, for those few moments, was smaller, quieter. Just him and that empty seat beside him. He turned his head slightly, looking at it again. The reserved sign had fallen to the floor. All that remained was the seat itself, untouched, unfilled, yet somehow heavy with meaning. He thought about how many premieres he'd been to over the years. He'd sat beside co-stars, directors, journalists, all of them temporary presences. But this seat was for someone permanent. Someone who had given him strength long before fame, long before loss. He remembered the hospital room again, the smell of antiseptic, the low hum of machines. His sister lying in bed, thin but smiling, pretending not to be in pain. He remembered reading lines from an old script, his voice breaking halfway through. She had laughed softly and said, "You can cry, Kiki. It doesn't make you weak." So he did. And when she was gone, he didn't know how to stop. He looked around the theater, the place where people came to feel alive through stories that weren't theirs. How ironic, he thought, that the truest story here tonight wasn't on screen. It was in the silence between two chairs. The applause finally began to fade, replaced by the low murmur of people gathering their things. Keanu stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. For a moment, he reached out and rested his hand on the back of the empty seat. His thumb brushed the smooth surface like one last touch, one last goodbye. He whispered something, just a breath, a sound lost in the noise, and then turned toward the exit. To everyone else, it looked like he was just leaving another premiere. But for him, it was like walking away from a conversation that had never really ended. Outside, the air was cooler now. The night had settled over Los Angeles, soft and calm, a strange contrast to the glittering noise he'd just left behind. Paparazzi waited near the entrance, lights ready, questions loaded, but Keanu walked straight past them. His steps were steady, slow, like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping memory. "Keanu, over here," someone shouted. "Smile for us," another called. He turned once, just enough to be polite, offered a small nod, and kept moving. He didn't owe them a smile tonight. Not when the one person who had loved him without condition couldn't see it anymore. A few fans lingered near the barricade, not screaming, just watching. One girl, maybe 16, held up a homemade sign that read, "You saved me." He paused, looked at her. Their eyes met for a second, and in that brief moment, something shifted. Maybe she meant it as a message about his movies, but to him, it meant something else. It reminded him of what his sister used to say. You never know who you're keeping alive just by being kind. He gave the girl a small wave and a quiet, genuine smile before disappearing into the car waiting at the curb. Inside, the world grew silent again. The driver said nothing. He'd worked for Keanu long enough to understand that some rides weren't meant for talking. As the car pulled away from the theater, Keanu rested his head against the window, watching the blur of city lights slide by. He thought about all the nights like this, premieres, interviews, bright lights that faded as quickly as they appeared. And he thought about how, for years, he had kept that seat empty, show after show, film after film. Not as a habit, not as a ritual, but as a promise. A promise that no matter how far he went, no matter how loud the world became, there would always be space beside him for the person who believed in him first. He closed his eyes and exhaled, the sound barely louder than the hum of the engine. Somewhere deep inside, he felt it, that quiet peace that comes not from forgetting, but from remembering right. Outside the car window, the city glowed, alive, endless, untouchable. Inside, Keanu sat alone, but not lonely, because some absences, he thought, are not empty at all. The car drove quietly through the city, the neon reflections sliding over the windows like liquid light. Keanu leaned his forehead against the glass, watching people on the sidewalks, laughing, crossing streets, living small, beautiful, ordinary lives. For a moment, he envied them. Not their happiness, but their simplicity, the freedom to exist without everyone watching. He pulled his phone from his pocket, thumb hovering over dozens of unread messages, congratulatory texts, articles tagging his name, interview requests. He locked the screen without reading a single one. None of it mattered tonight. As the car turned onto a quieter street, he spoke softly. "Stop here." The driver slowed down near a small park, the same one Keanu used to visit years ago with his sister when they were both nobodies, chasing their dreams on $10 coffees and shared laughter. It looked different now, cleaner, newer, but the memory was still there, breathing somewhere between the lampposts and the old oak tree in the middle. He stepped out, hands in his pockets, the chill brushing against his face. The city noise faded behind him. He walked slowly toward the bench beneath that oak, their bench. He could still see it in his mind. Two kids sitting there, planning impossible futures. She'd told him once, "When you're famous, don't forget to save a seat for me." He smiled faintly at the thought. "I didn't forget," he murmured. He sat down, staring up at the sky, the same one she used to point at, naming stars she never really knew. The wind rustled the leaves above, and for a second, he swore he heard her laugh. Light, quick, like a spark fading too soon. He whispered to the night, "You were right. You always are." In that quiet, no cameras, no applause, just a man and a memory shared between two worlds, the one he lived in and the one she never got to see. He stayed there until the city fell asleep. Then he stood, gave a small nod to the empty bench, and walked back to the car. Because grief, he'd learned, isn't about holding on, it's about keeping space open, even if it's just an empty seat. The drive home was long, and Los Angeles glowed in the distance like a living constellation, millions of lives unfolding at once, none of them knowing that one of the world's most famous actors was silently falling apart behind the tinted windows of a black sedan. Keanu sat in the back seat, head tilted slightly toward the window, the reflections of red traffic lights flickering across his face. To anyone else, it would have looked like just another late ride home after a premiere. But inside, his mind wasn't in the present. It was somewhere between memory and longing. He thought of her again, his sister, the way she'd talk about the stars as if they were alive, as if they could listen. He remembered one night years ago, long before the fame and the interviews and the loneliness that came with it. They were lying on the hood of his old car, staring up at a sky so full of light it didn't seem real. She had turned to him and said, "When you start feeling lost, just look up. I'll be somewhere out there, still annoying you." It had been a joke then, one of those moments you laugh about and forget. But he never forgot, because when she was gone, that line became a promise. The car stopped at a red light. and Keanu caught his own reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, graying hair, the faint trace of a smile that looked borrowed. He studied himself for a moment, and it hit him how strange life could be. People saw him as a symbol of strength, peace, kindness. Yet inside, he was still that boy sitting by his sister's hospital bed, wishing for one more day. The driver's voice broke the silence. "Home, sir." Keanu didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted to the night sky above the skyline. No stars tonight, only clouds painted by the city's glow. He sighed quietly, a sound too heavy to belong to someone who spent his life pretending to be unbreakable. "Not yet," he said softly. "Take the long way." The driver nodded and turned down an empty boulevard. The car hummed through the silence, passing streetlights that cast long shadows across the road. Each flash of light felt like a heartbeat, slow, steady, alive. Keanu leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He pictured her again, sitting in that empty theater seat, smiling at him the way she always did when she wanted him to know she was proud. And he smiled too, just slightly, the kind of smile that hurts and heals at the same time. He whispered into the dark, "I saved the seat for you. I always will." Outside, the city moved on, unaware, indifferent, alive. But inside that car, in the quiet between two heartbeats, a man and a memory shared a space no one else could ever enter. And in that space, she wasn't gone. She was right there, laughing softly, watching over him, still keeping her promise under a sky that never really forgets. By the time Keanu reached his home, the city was half asleep. The hills shimmered under a quiet moonlight, the kind that made everything softer, even loneliness. He stepped out of the car, thanked his driver with a small nod, and stood for a while in the driveway, staring at the night sky. The house was dark, no assistants waiting inside, no music, no noise. Just stillness, the kind he preferred. He unlocked the door, walked in, and dropped his keys on the counter. The faint echo of metal against marble felt louder than it should have. He slipped off his jacket, set it on the back of a chair, and walked toward the living room. The lights from the city below crept through the large windows, drawing long silver lines across the floor. He didn't turn on the lamps. The dim light was enough. On a shelf sat a framed photo, an old one, faded at the corners. Him and his sister in their 20s, sitting on that same park bench, laughing so hard the photo had caught them mid-motion. It wasn't perfect. Their hair was messy, his shirt was wrinkled, her smile slightly crooked. But that was what made it real. It was life, unfiltered and untimed. He picked it up, tracing a finger across her face. "You'd laugh if you saw all this," he whispered. "The premieres, the questions, the noise. You'd say it's all too much for one guy." He smiled faintly, remembering how she used to tease him for taking everything so seriously. "Loosen up, Kiki," she'd say. "You're not saving the world, you're just pretending on screen." But now, as he looked around at the quiet house, expensive, clean, and a little too empty, he realized something she'd known long before he did. Pretending was easy. Living was hard. He walked to the corner of the room where a piano stood, simple, black, untouched by anyone but him. He sat down, lifted the lid, and pressed a single key. The sound echoed softly, delicate and distant. He closed his eyes and began to play, slow, careful notes that rose and fell like breathing. It wasn't a song anyone knew. It was one he'd written years ago for her, back when she could still dance, back when the world didn't feel so heavy. Each note carried a piece of her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she'd hum when she was thinking. The melody filled the room like a ghost that didn't want to leave. When he finished, he sat there in silence, fingers still resting on the keys. His throat ached, but not from sadness, from gratitude. Gratitude that he'd known someone worth missing. He whispered into the quiet room, "I saved you a seat tonight." Then after a pause, softer, "You would have loved the movie." Outside, a breeze brushed against the window, swaying the curtains ever so slightly, as if something unseen had just passed by, smiling. Keanu looked up and smiled back. "Yeah," he said softly. "I felt that too." The next morning came slow, spilling light through the half-open blinds. Keanu woke to the soft warmth of the sun on his face. No alarms, no calls, no schedule. Just quiet. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and for a moment forgot it all. The premiere, the seat, the weight he carried. But grief never truly sleeps. It just waits for you to remember. He got out of bed and padded barefoot through the house. The floorboards were cool under his feet. The air faintly smelled of coffee from the night before. He brewed a fresh pot, black, strong, and leaned on the counter as it filled the kitchen with steam. The city below was alive again. Cars moving, people chasing time, the world resetting. But for Keanu, the day felt suspended, like the seconds didn't know where to go. He carried his mug to the window and looked out over the hills. The morning haze blurred the horizon, and for a fleeting second, it reminded him of a dream he used to have. His sister sitting on a beach, waving at him from far away, sunlight in her hair. He'd always wake up before he reached her. Always. He took a sip, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "You'd tell me to stop brooding," he said softly. "You'd probably say, go for a ride. Clear your head." And maybe she was right. He grabbed his leather jacket, the same one he'd worn for years. Old, cracked, familiar, and his motorcycle keys from the hook by the door. The engine roared to life, breaking the morning silence, its sound echoing through the canyon like a heartbeat. He rode without a destination, through empty roads lined with trees, past coffee shops opening their doors, past strangers who'd never know who he was under the helmet. The wind pushed against him, wild and freeing, like the world reminding him that he was still here, still breathing. At one stoplight, he caught sight of his reflection in a store window, just a man on a bike, nothing more. And for a moment, that felt perfect. He parked near a hill overlooking the city, killed the engine, and sat on the grass. The breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. He stared out over Los Angeles, the city that had taken so much from him and given him just enough to stay. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded paper star. It was the last thing his sister had made before she died. She used to fold dozens of them, scatter them across his desk, and say, "You can't touch the sky, Kiki, but you can still hold a star." He held it up toward the sunlight, its edges glowing faintly, and smiled. "Still holding it," he whispered. A single tear slipped down his cheek, not heavy, not dramatic, just real. The kind of tear that comes from love, not pain. He sat there for a while, letting the city breathe beneath him, until he finally whispered, "I'll keep saving that seat. Always." Then he tucked the paper star back into his pocket, started his bike, and rode off. The wind carrying the faintest echo of a woman's laughter that only he could hear. That evening, the city glowed again, but this time, he wasn't part of it. No cameras, no red carpets, no noise. Keanu spent the night in a small diner tucked away on the edge of town, the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Neon sign flickering, coffee always too bitter, jukebox humming softly in the corner. He liked places like this, ordinary, forgotten. They made him feel human. Here, nobody cared about movie premieres or box office numbers. Here, he was just another quiet man with tired eyes and calloused hands. The waitress recognized him, of course, but didn't say anything. She simply refilled his cup, smiled, and asked, "Rough day?" He shook his head. "Good day," he said after a pause. "Just a quiet one." He sat by the window, sipping coffee, watching the reflection of headlights slide across the glass. In that dim glow, he could see his sister's face again, not as a ghost, not as a wound, but as a memory that had softened around the edges. It didn't ache like before. It felt like peace. A couple at the next table were laughing about something silly, the kind of laughter that fills a room without asking permission. Keanu smiled to himself. His sister used to laugh like that, full-hearted, unfiltered, until she cried. He missed that sound. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he didn't miss it with sadness. He missed it with gratitude. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. Inside, there were no movie ideas or notes for interviews, just fragments of thoughts, words he wrote down when he couldn't say them out loud. On a fresh page, he wrote, "Some seats aren't empty. They're just invisible. Some love doesn't fade. It just changes shape." He looked at the words for a while, then closed the notebook gently, placing it beside his cup. The waitress returned and said softly, "You look like a man who's made peace with something." Keanu gave a small smile, the kind that said maybe. "Working on it," he replied. As he stepped outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain and asphalt. He stood beneath the neon glow, watching the light flicker, breathing in the kind of silence that comes only after you've told your story, even if no one heard it. He glanced up at the sky, whispering, "You'd have liked this place." A single drop of rain landed on his hand, and he laughed quietly. "Yeah," he said. "I'll take that as a yes." Then he slipped his hands into his pockets and walked away, the neon sign buzzing softly behind him. A heartbeat for a story only he and his sister would ever know. The next day dawned gray, the kind of Los Angeles morning where the sky looks like brushed metal, heavy but calm. Keanu woke early, long before the city came alive. His house was still and quiet, the kind of silence that didn't ache anymore, but wrapped itself around him like an old friend. He poured himself coffee and sat by the window, barefoot, staring out at the fog rolling over the hills. It reminded him of Canada, their childhood mornings, when the two of them would run down the street in the cold, breath turning into clouds. He could almost hear her voice calling after him. "Slow down, Kiki, you'll slip." He smiled, shaking his head at the memory. So much time had passed, yet some moments refused to fade. They stayed etched into him, as if written in light. He opened the notebook from the diner, flipping through pages of scribbled thoughts and half-written sentences. Most people saw him as quiet, mysterious, even. But his silence wasn't emptiness. It was filled with words he just didn't want to speak out loud. One line caught his eye, something he'd written months ago, late one night. "You can grieve and still be grateful." He traced his finger over it, nodding slightly to himself. That was what the empty seat had become, not a symbol of loss, but of love that refused to vanish. After a while, he stood and walked toward a room he rarely entered, his small home studio. There was an old armchair, a guitar leaning against the wall, and boxes of photos stacked neatly in the corner. Dust floated in the light as he opened one box and began to sort through the memories. Photos from the early days, him and his sister, smiling with scraped knees and messy hair. Polaroids from film sets, behind-the-scenes laughter, road trips, birthdays, blurry snapshots of moments that no one else would ever understand. He picked one up, a faded picture of the two of them sitting on the floor, eating takeout straight from the container, laughing like fools. He could almost hear the music they'd been playing that night, some old record she loved, one they played so often the vinyl had worn thin. He set the photo aside carefully and picked up his guitar. The strings were slightly out of tune, but he didn't care. He started to play, slow chords, gentle and rough at the same time, notes falling into the room like rain. Music had always been their language. When words failed, they played. And even now, the melody filled the empty house with something that felt alive. As he played, he spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "You know, I used to think grief meant holding on. But it's not, is it? It's learning to let them walk beside you. Invisible, but always there." He strummed the final chord and let it linger in the air until it disappeared into silence. Then he looked at the photo again, her smiling face, frozen in time, and whispered, "You still have your seat." The sunlight broke through the fog at that exact moment, pouring into the room, cutting across the walls like gold. It hit the photo first, the frame glinting, before reaching him. Keanu closed his eyes, letting it warm his face. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was remembering her. He felt like she was right there, remembering him too. That evening, Keanu went back to the same theater. The crowds were gone now. No cameras, no reporters, no red carpet. Just an empty marquee glowing faintly in the dark, the title of his movie still hanging there, fading letter by letter. He stood across the street for a long time, hands in his pockets, watching the building like it was a place from another life. The wind carried the faint scent of popcorn and rain. Familiar, nostalgic, human. He crossed the street and pushed open the glass doors. Inside, the lobby was half-lit, the kind of quiet that only existed when a place built for noise finally got to rest. A janitor was sweeping popcorn from the floor. He looked up, startled, then smiled when he recognized him. "Long night?" the man asked. Keanu smiled back. "Just visiting an old friend." He walked down the main aisle, slow, footsteps echoing softly. The theater felt smaller now, maybe because he wasn't walking through it as a celebrity, but as a brother. When he reached his row, he stopped. The same seat, the one that had stayed empty on premiere night, was still there. The reserved tag was gone, but he didn't need it anymore. He sat down quietly, the air thick with that strange mix of emptiness and presence. He didn't imagine her this time. He didn't need to. He just knew. He leaned back, resting his hand on the armrest where hers should have been, and whispered, "It's still yours." The projector flickered on unexpectedly. The janitor must have hit the wrong switch. For a few seconds, a random reel began to play, light spilling across the room. Dust floated through the beam like tiny stars. Keanu looked up at it and smiled. "I see you," he whispered. He stayed there for a long while, until the light cut out again and the room fell back into silence. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and took one last look at the seat. "Thank you," he said quietly, not to the room, but to her. When he stepped outside, the sky had cleared. The clouds were gone, and the stars were finally visible, bright, endless, alive. He pulled his motorcycle helmet over his head, but before he started the engine, he looked up one last time. "Still saving you a seat," he said softly. "Always." And then he rode off into the night, the city lights stretching behind him, the stars above him, and somewhere, in the quiet spaces between them, the laughter of a sister who never really left.